when I was trying to figure out a title for this piece, I remember going to my bookshelf and I took down like every book I had about hockey, which was like weirdly a lot. And I remember just going through them and trying to find language. And I took down all the books I have about like the AIDS quilt also. And it was Kate that told me about Zoe Sophia, who is a infrastructure theorist, and she has a great text called Container Technologies, and I'll always be grateful for Kate to for telling me about that, and I'll sort of connect container technologies and the project and how it makes sense later on. Just as a little background, I'm pretty sure Jacqueline asked me to be a part of this show because a lot of the work I've done in the past is about sports. And my interest in sports has always very much been about sort of like the marginal and the ritualistic parts of sports. So things that happen kind of on the sidelines, things that happen during practice, the more intimate moments. I've never really been too interested in virtuosity or excellence and what those things mean. And I've always, for myself as a queer individual who participates in sports and also thinks about sports, I've always been interested in sport because it's a way for bodies to come together and to push up against one another and to sweat together in ways that aren't always sanctioned outside of this kind of structure of sports. Of course, that's changing, but not even fast enough. I'm going to start in on container technologies. So when Jacqueline asked me to be a part of this show, I went away and I thought about what I could do. And I will admit I was having a bit of a hard time. I don't have a relationship to hockey. I don't watch it that much. My biggest takeaway is I have always been kind of interested in how in women's hockey, the rink seems to be used very differently. Maybe that's true or not, but it's always been kind of like been my takeaway that like the curves of the rink are kind of utilized differently. So in all honesty, I was about to get in touch with Jacqueline and be like, nothing came up. I don't really have anything. I'm sorry. Thank you. And I happened upon an article that the CBC had just put out, and it was about how the Canadian AIDS Memorial quilt was being kept in goalie bags at the Canadian AIDS Society. And maybe a little bit in the same way, Didier, when you mentioned coming across that hockey jersey in Value Village and somehow things kind of made sense, and hearing this and kind of like, what are the chances of just happening to hear this news story in a moment when I was trying to figure out sort of a project having to do with hockey. When those two things kind of came together, I felt very, very lucky. And also a lot of my practice deals with archives and textiles and AIDS kind of having ravaged so much of the LGBTQ plus community. Like I feel it felt like a perfect storm, for lack of a better word. And so what you're looking at right now are 22 hockey bags, they're goalie bags, and they've got the pieces of the AIDS memorial quilt, the Canadian AIDS memorial quilt. And what I'm going to do right now, because I feel a very huge responsibility to this piece, because within these bags are quilt pieces and panels that represent people who have died of AIDS over the last, few decades. And I have written something, so I'm just going to read it, and then I'll kind of go through my slides and kind of give you like anecdotal little bits. But I feel a responsibility to the peoples whose lives are kind of being commemorated that I'm, borrowing, using, sort of parasiting off different institutions to keep them climate controlled. And for that sake, I will go ahead and just read this out. So here we go. The AIDS Memorial Quilt is a massive community-made textile monument begun in the US in 1987 to remember thousands of people who died during what is known as the North American AIDS crisis of the 80s and 90s. When it was shown in its entirety for the last time in 1996, it covered the National Mall in Washington, D.C. As the quilt toured Canada in 1989, Canadians added their own panels to the project. Inspired by their American counterparts, Canadian activists started their own organization to facilitate the creation and stewardship of Canadian-made textile quilt panels. The Canadian portion of the quilt is comprised of more than 600 3-by-6-foot panels and is stored by the Canadian AIDS Society in 22 hockey bags donated by Molson Breweries. And yes, it is that Molson Breweries. These bags are kept on shelves, or they were being kept on shelves in the Society's Ottawa office. And I think right now the Society has moved, so now they're in storage. And yeah, assembled the Canadian quilt panels would almost cover standard hockey rink. Friends, lovers, family members, community groups, each made panels to remember their loved ones as they lived. Using various materials, panel makers created intimate monuments to what was special about the person they lost to AIDS-related illnesses. Portraits, sequins, applique, paint, old clothes, the representations of hobbies adorn these panels. Some panels have names, some have messages and birth dates and death dates. Others are anonymous. Nothing about these panels is standardized except their shape and size, chosen to reference a gravesite's footprint. Because of the quilt size, the fragility of the textiles as they age, and the lack of funding for AIDS memorial projects, this piece is very difficult to store and preserve. It is nonetheless a crucial part of our history and a reminder that HIV, which, if you don't know, is the virus that can lead to AIDS, is ongoing. In Canada, the illness continues to disproportionately affect vulnerable populations, especially men who have sex with men, people who use injection drugs, youth, and Indigenous people. The history of the AIDS epidemic is one about a lack of access, stigma, colonialism, racism, homophobia, and many other forms of violence. I didn't know the best way to kind of represent those people. In the actual show, a list of everyone who is represented by one of the quilt panels is on a didactic. It felt very important that people's names, people are conjured in some way with their names there, and I wasn't sure how to do it here, so I made a scrolling video with people's names. It was just, you know, it really felt like this amazing moment to like use the opportunity of a show about hockey to talk about AIDS and HIV, which like is not over. And also, you know, as somebody who really kind of appreciates material culture, I was like, what in the world is going on? Like, you know, so if you look at the bags, it says Molson Partners in the Fight Against AIDS. I think it's AIDS, or does it say HIV? I think it's AIDS. And it's just this really interesting moment. Like, what was the thinking behind making goalie bags instead of perhaps actual bags that could more properly hold textile pieces? It's just kind of this interesting collision of these kind of worlds, which are often thought of as quite polar, but really aren't in many, many ways. As promised, I just wanted to go back and just quickly reference sort of what the title brings to the piece, and I think why this piece is so dear to me. Like, I really, it's such a, it can kind of exist as this like sculpture, really, you know, and quite formal, and it kind of can live that way quite nicely. But then it also, I think, does a really important job in inviting sort of dialogue between like hockey's material culture, queerness, and Canadian nationalism, you know, and to just kind of reference container technologies. These are just like weighty concepts that resist containment. And so thinking about not just what is held, but what does the holding. And I'm just really quite interested in that, and you know, and thinking about these bags and what happened to get these bags to that point. And yeah, because often we think about what is held, and to kind of like sister that with what does the holding, because if you think about these bags and what they are holding in these past and these lives, you know, these are objects that are very big and too devastating and heavy, but also things that require protection and care. And I think to be able to do that when in the context of a hockey show is quite, it feels very special. And so I really appreciate the opportunity